And when we enter back into the worship center, hopefully at the end of March, that's our plan. That's why we hope that this is our halfway point. And everything seems to be on schedule as we know it right now. But thank you so much for your generosity in both your giving and allowing us to meet together as a church family, for making the sacrifices to meet here in the youth building and also in the fellowship hall, and then also just the time that it takes to stack chairs every Sunday, and if you're in the fellowship hall, to stack the chairs and put the walls up for your small group. There's been a bunch of sacrifices by us as a church family, and I want to say thank you for that. And hopefully, you've heard me say thank you. I think we've said it about 6 or 7 times this week. I just want to say thank you for everyone for making that happen. So, I ended the video with, how does this tie into ministry? Because all that we're doing is a project that we're doing as an organization, as a church. But what are we doing as a church body to prepare as well? And that's where our roadmap is going to lead us today. And so I want to challenge you with this question, or these 2 questions. Are you preparing for, or are you waiting on the next chapter in following God? There's a difference between those 2 things. Are you preparing for, or are you waiting on our next chapter in following God? And then when God gets here and God shows up and asks us to take that next step in our faith journey with Him, are you going to allow God to use you, or are you going to force God to go around you? Those are the 2 questions I want you to ponder this morning as we study God's Word, as we see what He has for us. And so I want you to think about those things. And so our topic this morning is going to be preparation. Are you prepared? Are you preparing? So what's the definition of preparation? I like this definition that I found this is the first one on Google, but I really liked it. It's the action or process of making ready or being made ready for use or consideration. Man, when I think about the next chapter that God has for us, I want to be ready to be used by God. I want you to be ready to be used by God. I want God to consider us when He goes to continue building His church in Tallahassee for His kingdom purpose. I want Him to do that for us. Preparation makes us ready for an opportunity. That was another piece of wisdom I found when I was looking at some kind of the business world things and thinking about how they talk about preparation. Preparation makes us ready for an opportunity. And I like the way that just rings true to me, because opportunity is what happens when God shows up, right? God's going to work. God's going to continue to work. God's going to show up. He's going to make things happen. There's going to be an opportunity to join Him. And so our question, like I said at the beginning, is, are we ready for that opportunity? And preparation makes us ready for that opportunity. I want to make this distinction, as I said in the question. Preparation is not the same thing as waiting. Preparation is an action. It is a forward movement towards the goal. It may not feel like it at the time, but it really is. And I want to tell you this from a story that was in my life. So when you're in seminary and you're preparing to go into ministry full time, you wind up in seminary, you're in school, and you just sit there and you get about halfway through, and you sit there and you go, man, I just wish I could get to the end of school. I wish I could be done with this preparing moment. I wish I could just be done and be in the ministry that God has for me. And I remember thinking that, and I remember longing for it to be over, and God put this great conviction on me, and He said, Josh, you're not waiting to get there. The time that between now and then is not time wasted. It's time that is used for me to prepare you for the ministry that's going to happen. And so I want to challenge us. Have you ever been into that kind of moment in your life? And I want you to think about that. A time when you're waiting on a pivotal moment to happen. It's kind of how it feels like for us in the life of our church over the last few years, isn't it? We've been here, and the last time we had a clear purpose and direction that we were working towards was probably about 5 years ago, right? And we had an interim period, and then we got our next lead pastor, and then we had COVID that happened right after that, and then right after we kind of got out of COVID, we found ourselves in an interim period again. And so it feels, when I've talked to people, it's just like we're just waiting for the next step, waiting for the next chapter. And I really want to challenge us with, if we're just waiting on the next chapter, we're not going to be ready when God shows up. We're not. Because when God shows up, and we're going to look at this through the story of Abraham, when God shows up, it's not usually easy what he's going to ask us to do or what he's going to ask us to join him in. Do you realize that? That's the good news is when we talk about this, there will be a next step when God shows up. The bad news is it's going to be a challenge when God shows up, because we're going to look at that in the story of Abraham, and hopefully that'll help you see this, because maybe you say, no, it'll be easy to follow God, but just join me with this. Let's go to Genesis 12, 1 through 4 together. So in Genesis 12, 1 through 4, this is the beginning of the story of Abraham. And so God's going to give him his first promise here. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So what is the first thing that happens in Abraham's story? God makes him a promise to make him a great nation, to make his name great. For what purpose? To be a blessing to all that he encounters, to be a blessing to all nations. And he says to go. And then where does he tell him to go? Was there a specific name in there? No. He said, to a place I'll show you, right? God doesn't clear on what he's going on the destination. And so Abram has to take a step of faith and saying, you know what, God, I'm going to trust you. When I look at that in our story in the life of the church, not just Thomasville Road Baptist Church, but in the life of the church, God made a promise when it started with his disciples, with Peter and Matthew. He says, on you I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not persevere against it. God has made a promise to the local church that he will build it and use it to accomplish his kingdom's mission. And so the promise that I want to say for us today is this. God has made a promise that he wants to build his kingdom here in Tallahassee. And we have the choice that as a church, a specific church, Thomasville Road Baptist Church, we can either be a part of God's plan and be a tool used by him, or we can choose not to be and have him go around us. But when I talk about that, it sounds like I'm talking about the organization of the church. But really, what is the church? It's the body of believers. So the question really is are we the people ready for God to use us in his next chapter? So if we were to have time, which we don't, to go through the entire story of Abraham, as if you were to flip over with me to chapter 17, you would flip over and you would see all kinds of stories. You would see right after Abraham leaves, he gets to the promised land and lives in it, and then challenges happen, and he ends up selling his wife as a sex slave, and that becomes a real problematic thing in his life. And then God has to rescue that and redeem that and cause them to wash out Abram's action. And then he ends up, him and his nephew separate, and he goes on, and he ends up having to save him from the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then God reiterates his covenant with him in chapter 15. And you would think, okay, last time God gave him a promise and he walked in it, he failed. You would think he would have learned from that. But instead, in 15, when God gives him a covenant, and then chapter 16, he ends up God makes him a promise to the nation. He says, no, how about we do it through Hagar, Sarah's servant? And that's where you end up in chapter 17. And this is where we're going to read for a second. 17 verse 1 with me, which was 1 through 4. It says, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and you may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. So God reiterates the same promise to him. If we were to keep reading, he tells him how he's going to show to keep that promise, and we're going to jump in at verse 15 and look at his actions together. It says, and God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but you shall call her Sarah. shall be your name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, no, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. And this is Abraham's actions. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael, his son, and all those born in his house, or bought with his money, and every male among them of Abraham's house he circumcised the flesh of his foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. So what did Abraham do? God reiterated his covenant with him, his promise to him. And this time, Abraham took actions preparing for Isaac to come. This is where I think that we are today when we stop and think about it. We've been through some challenging times. We've been through some good times. We've joined God over, I think our church is around 70 years old, I think. We've joined God for over 70 years in accomplishing his task. And it feels like we've been in this little hiccup period. But as we look forward, you think about the things that we've done as an organization to prepare over the last really year or a few years. You know, we've changed our governance structure. We're remodeling the worship center. We're hopefully close on getting a new senior leader for our church, and all these things that we have done as an organization to be ready. But as I was thinking about this, as we were prepared to celebrate the halfway point, or what's hopefully the halfway point of the worship center, God really challenged my heart, and he said, hey, we can do all these right things as a church, but it doesn't matter if the people aren't ready to join me, because the church is the body. So my challenge for us is this, are we going to be like Abraham? We know God's promise, and that is that he wants to build his church and to use it to accomplish his kingdom's work here in Tallahassee. That's God's promise. It has not changed. Just an Abraham story, God's promise to Abraham never changed. So for us, God's promise never changed. So the question is now, the promise is ahead, right? In Abraham's story, the promise, Isaac still has not been born. And we all know that happens when Isaac is born. God gives Sarah a child, Isaac is born, and then as soon as the child is born, what does God say? After a few years, he says, hey, go take him and sacrifice him. Well, what? That's going to break the promise. But we all know what happens is God shows up, says, Abraham, wow, your faith really is in me. Time for me to bless you, right? And make all the promises come true that I've said. And so I think about that for us. We're in this point in my mind of chapter 17. God has reiterated his promise to us. He's making all these things happen in the life of our church as an organization. But now it's time to say, are we then preparing to join God so when he does show up, that we're ready to say yes to whatever he calls us to do? Because what if when God shows up, it feels like an Abraham and Isaac moment? Are you ready to jump and follow God? And when he asks us to do something that seems so crazy and so wild that we don't even have a clue how he can work it out? Think about that. I find that as every time we follow God, he doesn't ask us to do something easier the next time. He usually asks us to do something harder. And sometimes it may feel easier because we've built the habit of following God. But I really want us to hone in on this today and to ask ourselves, are we preparing to follow God? Are we preparing to join him? I want you to hear Jesus' warning in Matthew 25, 1 through 13, when it comes to being ready. Matthew 25, 1 through 13 says this, then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil for their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him. Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise answered, saying, "Since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves." And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterwards, the other virgins came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he answered, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, you know neither the day nor the hour." So I want to challenge us with this as we prepare to enter a time of invitation. Guys on the team, if you'll just wait, I know I have some more time this morning. I really, really want us to hone in on this and ask us ourselves these questions. Are we preparing for God to use us in the next chapter? Or are we going to be like what happened in this story? We're waiting on God, unprepared, so that when he shows up, we miss out. It's a real warning. I know the story and the heart of the parable is meaning when Christ returned, but I think it is applicable to take that same principle and apply it to every step of the journey with God. That when God shows up, are we ready to join him? One of my favorite writers his name is Dr. Henry Blackaby, and he's the one who kind of inspires me to always think about it this way, is that he says, if you want to follow God, then you need to be prepared to join him instead of trying to figure out what you want to do for God and hope that he blesses it. So that's why I keep saying in this way, are we preparing to join God? Because let me tell you, when we decide to join God, we get to be part of stuff way cooler than we would have ever come up with. When we take time to prepare and to be ready to join God, it makes it a whole lot easier to say yes to him. I got to experience this in my life at one point in time. It was actually right before I came here in 2012. It was May. I had graduated from the University of Alabama, and I am doing my summer job. I worked at the University of South Alabama. Those are two different places during the summer. And because of where I lived in Mobile, where that was, and where the campus was, I had about a 30-minute commute, which seems pretty long, right? Especially for here in Tallahassee. We don't really have too many 30-minute commutes. But it was a pretty long commute because of morning traffic. And so I was going and I was driving each and every day on this long commute, and a lot of slow and a lot of patience, right, to get there. And so it was about the third week into the job, God begins to speak to me in May, at the end of May. And he says, "Hey, Josh, when you move to Tallahassee, I'm going to ask you to do something you don't want to do. So I want you to go ahead and say yes." I said, "God, why would I never not follow you? Of course I'll say yes." Go on to work that day. Wake up the next morning, go to get in my car, begin driving to work again. God says, "Hey, Josh, when you go to Tallahassee, I'm going to ask you to do something you don't want to do. So I want you to go ahead and say yes now." And I was like, "God, we had this conversation yesterday. I told you yesterday, of course, I would follow you." This goes on Wednesday, and it goes on Thursday. And on Friday, I feel like I was in one of those biblical moments, like, where Peter, denies Christ or something like this, and you have this moment where God speaks again to you, and you go, "Okay, God, clearly I don't get it. What is it that you want me to do?" He said, "I've told you, when you get to Tallahassee, I'm going to ask you to do something you don't want to do, so say yes now." So I kind of broke down in my spirit, and I said, when I get to Tallahassee, God's going to ask me to do something I don't want to do. I'm kind of nervous now because what in the world could be this challenging? But then I sat down and I said, "You know what, God? Whatever it is, I'll say yes. No matter what. No matter what I find out, no matter how much I don't want to do it, no matter how hard it may be, I'm going to say yes." Fortunately for me, I told my wife this story about what was happening. I chose to wait till the day we were on the way in the car to get our marriage certificate from the courthouse before we got married. Probably not the best time, but I thought she was trapped at that point. So I told her about it then, but I'm grateful that I did. Because when we moved to Tallahassee, we came to Thomasville Road the first Sunday, We went to a wedding the next weekend, and we came back our third week in Tallahassee. We came back to church here. And that was a day that one of the youth pastors at the time had resigned, and God kind of puts on my heart, and he says, hey, why don't you call up there and offer to serve and help out? Just, you know what they're going through. You interned at your church. You know how hard it is, the situation there is. And I said, God, I don't even know if I'm supposed to go to church here, let alone like be a volunteer here. But he's like, I want you to do it. And my wife, somehow, because she's more attuned with God than me, I guess sometimes, she's like, oh, this is the church for us. When I told her what God was saying to me, she's like, oh, yeah, I already knew this. This is right. And so I said, okay. So I call and I offer to help out. And they end up saying, hey, we're thinking about hiring a part-time person. Would you be interested in as a job? And I was like, no, not at all. I said, 1, there's no part-time ministry. 2, I already have a job. And 3, I'm in grad school full-time. And 4, I just got married, so no. And they said, well, we really think you should come and interview with us. So I go and I interview with them. And then to my detriment and fear, they call me 2 weeks later and they're like, we really think you're the right person for this and we want to offer you the job. And I just go home and I am distraught because I get this call during the day and I'm after grad school and I look at Katie and I was like, Katie, I got this offer. They really think I should do it. And I was like, this is not right. We can't do this. And then, of course, you can obviously already hear the words that she said. She said, hey, remember how you told me this summer that when we moved to Tallahassee, God was going to ask you to do something you didn't want to do. So say yes now. I said, yeah. She goes, I think this is it. And I go, oh, I think you're right because I really don't want to do this. So I said yes to God. And then over the next few months, God stripped away my whole desires to do the program I was in at Florida State. Gave me a desire to serve him in ministry. And the story is, as you can say, as I don't know, I blanked on it. It is as it was, right, from then on. But when I come back to that story, and I want to tell it to you this way, for us now, I think we're in the same kind of moment. I think for us as a life of our church, we're in the same kind of moment. God wants to use our church. But let me tell you the truth about it. Ministry is always hard. Ministry is always hard. Joining God is always hard. Because if it was easy, we could figure out and do it ourselves and take credit. But when God wants to do something, it's something that only he can do. Therefore, there's a whole lot of trust that has to go into it to trust him. Because I would have never traded my life now for the life I could have had. But I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know how he was going to get me to here, but he has. And so the same thing for the life of our church. I have no idea what amazing things God has for us if we say yes to him now and preparing our hearts to join him here in the coming months and seasons that are ahead. But what I do know is that if we do it, we'll get to experience some of the wildest, most amazing things that we ever could. And so I'm going to ask the team to come up here as we prepare to have a time of response. And I want to challenge you with this. As I said, we've done all these things as an organization to get ready. Now I think it's time for us to be challenged. Are you getting ready as a person? Are you in your spirit preparing yourselves to, A, be able to hear from God when he shows up, and 2, be willing and ready to say yes to God when he shows up? Because I promise you, like I've said, he's already made his promise. He's going to show up. And when he shows up, we can either choose to be a tool used by him, or we can be an obstacle that he then goes around. If you're around me long enough, you'd hear me say this. When it comes to following and serving God, I always liken it to the story of Jonah. God has a place that he wants us to get to, and we either can choose to just go there first, or we can take the detour through the fish. And I want to avoid the fish, personally. That's just me. I want to avoid the fish because God's going to choose to show up, and I'd rather just join him and be a part of what he has instead of taking the hard journey, the harder road of ignoring him, having him get my attention, and then saying, okay, I'll follow you. So what does that look like for us? This morning, as we have a time of response, I want you to take the time, and I want you to ask yourself, what are you doing to prepare? So do you know his promises? Are you hiding them in your heart? Are you preparing for him to show up? Meaning, are you looking for him? Are you listening for him? And then when you see him and when you hear from him, are you prepared to say yes? Are you willing to ready to say that, hey, God, when you show up, I know it's going to be better than anything else that I have going on right now. So I'm going to say yes to whatever it is, and I'm going to join you. I want to challenge you to ask yourself those questions as we have a time of response, to pray and ask God to show you where you are,